Welcome, everybody, to the climate panel. We're going to unpack a little bit the subject of this panel. But first, I want to introduce, myself. I'm Nayeli. I work for the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. I'm a program director, and I collaborate a lot with other city departments on new technology pilots and approaches, specifically around climate and often involving technology as well. I'm going to let each of you introduce yourselves and also provide a little icebreaker question for everybody. So when you introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your current role in organization, can you also talk about what a climate resilience issue that feels urgent to your organization is right now? And the reasoning behind this question that I want to get at is that we heard a lot today in the opening comments about how data and technology and science should be or could be leveraged to transform communities. And I want to question that question a little bit. Is there an urgent issue for your organization that feels like it can be transformed by data, science, and technology? So over to you first, Zoe.
Thanks, Natalie. Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe Davis. I'm project manager with the City of Boston's Environment Department, and specifically I work within the Climate Ready Boston team. Climate Ready Boston, for folks who may not be familiar, is the city's plan to prepare for the impacts of climate change. So looking at the near term and the long term. So recently my work has focused on heat resilience. The City of Boston just put out its heat plan. So that's essentially to answer your icebreaker question. I think that's been top of mind, particularly for me, but for our team. We've done a lot of work on the coastal resilience side, and we work with Boston Water and Sewer Commission to integrate green stormwater practices. And so heat is this next space. And I'd say, it's really top of mind because it is a present risk, something that I think as Northeasterners we don't think about until we get really hot in our 30-story apartments. We know that those risks will increase in the future, and so that's why it's the most significant issue. I think just to be more specific about heat risk, thinking about access to cooling resources and increasing access to cooling resources, especially for environmental justice communities and folks who have been historically disadvantaged. So.
Okay, cool. Hi, I'm Scott Hersey. I'm on faculty at Olin College of Engineering. I run the Air Partners group there. And the goal of the Air Partners group is to come alongside advocacy organizations and environmental justice communities to help them reach their goals around air quality. So sometimes that involves data, other times it involves running pilot programs to reduce exposure to indoor pollutants. It just really depends on how we're listening to the community and the groups that we work with. So that's what I do. I think the icebreaker question, we're most interested in the intersection between climate resilience and air quality. There are ways that there can be co-benefits to strategies to address both of those things. There's also ways that they could be in tension with one another and exacerbate one another. So I think that's something that we think about.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Priyanka Rangadass. I am the development coordinator with GreenRoots. We are a environmental justice grassroots organization based in Chelsea. We do work in Chelsea and East Boston, and in other environmental justice communities around the creek. And to answer your question, Nayeli, I think heat and air quality were the two things that came to mind. I think GreenRoots in Chelsea, we hold a lot of environmental burdens, and so I think we've known about the injustices that are plaguing our community. We've known that for a while, and I think the pandemic kind of showed a really large spotlight on these environmental burdens. And so we've been kind of using that momentum and doing a lot of work in air quality, doing a lot of work on extreme heat and trying to fight so another pandemic doesn't devastate Chelsea like it did.
Thanks. So I want to ask the flip side of that question as well, since we're unpacking this question of data for what and research for what and for whom. What is a solution or a proposed solution or approach to climate resilience that you feel like is currently getting too much airtime and you'd like to hear people talk less about? Yeah.
I'll start. You have to say this was a tricky question for me to try to find an answer to. Just thinking about the prioritization of some of these issues. I think in thinking about solutions around heat resilience and trying to ensure access to cooling, we talk a lot about like people going from their homes and going to a cool space, which we might think would make sense, especially if you were living in the third floor of a triple decker that doesn't have central air. If you don't have access to it, we would think, okay, you should go and find a place. But what we've been hearing from folks is that they want to be in their own homes. They want to be in their space. They don't necessarily like want to go out unless there's something to go out for, whether it's for a movie or to get a coffee or something like that. And I think we put a lot of emphasis on like our cooling centers, our public cooling spaces. They do serve an important purpose, and I do think they're important. But I think there's a lot of emphasis on like trying to draw people out of their space. And I think even still, there's an emphasis on like the public spaces. And so acknowledging that there are these informal spaces, these existing community spaces where people go. Libraries are yes a public space, but they're not like the official cooling centers of Boston. But they're still established public spaces that people access, for fun. So, expanding how we're thinking about what a cool space is, I think is like the direction that we want to move in.
Yeah, I have a hard time thinking about answering this as well.
You don't all have to answer every single question as well.
Okay, I think, echoing Zoe a little bit though, I feel like we have built cooling structures or put up misting stations in Chelsea, and I think prioritizing and ensuring that individuals who can't physically leave their home and making sure that we are capturing all vulnerable folks is something that we need to prioritize more of.
Yeah. I don't know if that's an interesting. So let's return to this question of like data for what? Why do we care about data? Do we care about data at all? We're at a data conference, but maybe we don't actually care about it. Dan's like putting his head in his hands right now. So I want to understand from you, from your organization and experience specifically, not generally, but for your organizations and the people that you talk to day to day, when is data necessary and when is it irrelevant to doing the work that you do?
I can start. I think in Chelsea, we have a lot of data collection going on. A lot of researchers are coming into Chelsea and wanting to talk to residents, collect data, and do all these things that are very extractive. And I think that was one of the biggest things we've heard from residents. Our organization works really closely with our community members, and we prioritize them in a way that research collection has really not, the community members haven't really been a priority to researchers, and we've seen that in a lot of ways, whether it's language barriers, lack of compensation, whatever it may be. And so I think for us, for GreenRoots, I think data is really important to inform the work that we're doing. I think it helps set a roadmap. It helps show like what our priorities need to be. But I do think for our community members, there are these processes that don't put our residents' lived experiences, put them at the forefront. So that is something that I think as an organization, we really put residents and bring their solutions to the forefront of environmental justice issues. And I think researchers, that is something that they can take away from that in terms of bringing residents and making sure that they are centered in whatever data collection that is happening.
I'd like to hear your response to that, Scott. Not necessarily to put you in opposition, because I know that you are not, but as a researcher, where have you found that data was necessary, and where did you found that data was not helpful at the end to your research objectives?
Yeah, I think in our experience, before we started the Air Partners Group, we spent the full year just engaging with community partners to listen and really understand where does an absence of data prevent you from achieving your goals? We heard over and over in East Boston, please don't tell us how bad the air quality is, because we know it's bad. All that's going to do is increase our sense of disempowered fear about the air that we're breathing. So don't just tell us that. What we actually want is access to strategies to reduce our exposure. And through continued community engagement, that narrowed down to providing free HEPA air purifiers for indoor spaces. But then there was also a piece where data was relevant. And that piece where it was relevant was narrowing down into, if we set up a community-owned air quality monitoring network, what are we doing with that? What questions are we trying to answer? Are we trying to demonstrate just what the baseline air quality is in the community and publicize how bad it is? Or are we trying to get at something more specific? And specific questions arose the more we talked with community partners, including GreenRoots, in the community. And one of those specific questions was, can we quantify the extent to which Logan Airport is exacerbating air pollution in our community? So that became a really specific question that it was actually a blocker to their advocacy work. So, they can say, yeah, we know that air quality is bad. We assume the airport is responsible for a lot of it, but there were no data to actually demonstrate that. So that became a specific question that we could answer. Our work right now with ACE and Roxbury similarly went through a process of saying, we really want to reduce people's exposure. A community-owned air monitoring network isn't necessarily going to do that, but what we are curious about is the extent to which Nubian Station and diesel powered bus lines are exacerbating pollution exposure in our community. So can we build a network that answers that specific question, because that's aligned with our advocacy goals?
I think that's a great segue into another question that I have, which is how are you all thinking about authenticity in your public engagement? Some of the things that you were mentioning about the presence of the airport and the use of diesel fuel in city buses, decisions about those pieces of infrastructure aren't necessarily in your hands as a researcher. They're not necessarily even in our hands, at a city level. So how are you authentically engaging communities on this question of data and research design when actions that the research is pointing to being necessary aren't actually within any of our control? I'm gonna start with Zoe.
So, I really like this question because it's an active one that we're having, at least within my team, or that we were trying to answer, at least within my team. One thing that comes to mind for me is for the heat plan, we had developed a process to try to integrate community perspectives and expertise sort of closer into the planning process. The way that we tried to do that was through community advisory boards. We had one community advisory board for the heat plan composed of a diverse group of folks from across the city. And primarily their partnership was to support where we were trying to like identify like specific areas in the city where we were where folks were experiencing extreme heat and trying to identify why that may be. So they were helping us to sort of target outreach and then to like form the strategies. So I think in that we succeeded in our approach with the CAB because their ideas were brought in, I would say, almost verbatim brought into some of these strategies. I think though, what we would like to explore is a sense of ownership. I think deeper ownership over elements of our processes. And so one way that we try to do that, and by ownership, I mean, you know, the CAB has sort of this carved out designated space where they're sort of taking on a process, and from start to finish, these ideas are theirs, and we're producing a product that ultimately is theirs. And one way we tried to do that was with a series of resource guides. Our thinking there was to say, based on the information that we're getting from the broader Boston community, can you help us identify some near-term actions or near-term strategies that we can be sort of putting out to the wider Boston community and trying to increase awareness about heat resilience actions. And so what we produced, these resource guides, is directly from the CAB. Originally, we had presented a series of topics on, you know, how to stay cool or various other things, and they were like, actually, this isn't what our community needs. But here are some examples of actions and resources that would be useful to folks. And so we had essentially like scrapped our original ideas and really listened to what they were saying and created a new product with that. So that's one thing that comes to mind for me. But we're still trying to grow in that space.
How about the two of you? Thoughts on how to be authentic in bringing communities into your research while acknowledging that they don't necessarily have the power to enact the solutions that you might be led to?
I said a little bit. I think one thing as an academic that's been important for us to maintain some authenticity is distancing ourselves to the extent that we can from the perverse motivations of academic systems, which is to publish papers and to get more grants so we can get tenure and keep our jobs. You will be extractive if that's your end goal. So yeah, that's hard to do because if you totally distance yourself and lose your job, then you can't do the work, right? So I think holding those the somewhat competing goals of communities and the academic system, holding that tension and trying to navigate it is one way that we try to have some authenticity. I think the other thing, just to echo Zoe, is to take our lead from community partners. We work primarily with advocacy groups who are good at what they do. ACE in Roxbury has a strong history of effective advocacy that has resulted in policy and new types of changes and emissions reductions. And so we trust their expertise. And when they say, this is what we need to do to achieve our next goal, we say, great, let's do that together. So it's really about trusting community partners and the stuff that they're good at. And making peace with the knot in our stomach that we'd really love to see something happen tomorrow, but it's a long game for a lot of these changes.
I want to give you the chance to answer that question too, because I know that this is a big issue in Chelsea as well.
Yeah, so GreenRoots is a community-based organization, and we are really based in our community. I think our organization is member-led, it's resident-led, and we really work in a myriad of ways with our community members to bring their solutions to the forefront. I think language justice is like a very, very big priority for GreenRoots. We do simultaneous translations for all of our in-person meetings, Zoom meetings as well, and any like hard flyers, documents, they're going out in multiple languages. So we're really working and meeting the needs of our community. I think all the advocacy work, all the campaigns, all the solutions are born out of residents. And I think GreenRoots, we have a deep commitment to our residents, and I think that's how we make progress, because their lived experiences and those are the solutions.
I want to dwell on something that Scott was just mentioning about how before you embarked on your actual research, you spent a long time actually just trying to develop relationships, which is an approach that I really want to commend, because often the city is approached for partnership on research or on data collection, and the city, as Zoe can probably also attest, is not a proxy for having an authentic relationship with members of the community. In fact, the city has its own challenges in being authentic and developing trust amongst community members for very good reasons. So I have to say, I really appreciate hearing that you took the time, and I would like academics in the room to appreciate that approach and potentially replicate it in your own projects as well. On that note, I would love to hear, we've been talking a lot about things that maybe need to change or haven't quite struck the right tone yet. Where do you have optimism, and where have you seen good examples of data collection and using data, technology, and research with communities to produce a result or produce a process that was respectful and was responsive? I would love to hear like some specific stories about that.
Okay, so the one thing I think that came to mind is, I forget what this acronym stands for, but MGH has a health center based in Chelsea, and a group of providers and researchers kind of came together and were thinking, how do we get the community more involved? So they started, it's ABCR, or an acronym of that sort. I won't get lost in it, but their goal was to bring in partners, stakeholders, community members, and make sure that residents were having a voice in the research process. And so I thought the way they approached it, and I think they really wanted feedback. So their goal was, we know there's a lot of research going on in Chelsea. How can we make sure that this is serving our residents, serving our community organizations, and it's not data that's just going out and there's nothing happening with it. So their process of bringing together these partners, bringing together stakeholders, and bringing together community members was a really positive way of approaching research and seeing if this, whatever project was being reviewed was actually serving the community. So I think that was something that was a really positive approach.
Yeah, one example that comes to mind, if you know Eric Gordon at Emerson, they've had an institutional initiative around telling stories about gun violence in Boston. And I think something that for me is really powerful about that is ultimately they want to see change happen in reducing gun violence. And there probably will be a stage where data get collected and used toward those goals. The first thing that they did though was a year-plus long campaign to understand the stories, the personal stories, the community stories of gun violence in the city. And I think starting with a storytelling approach of who are the real people? What are the lives being impacted? How are communities being impacted before we start to do tangible change-making, data collecting, advocacy things? Let's understand the stories. I think for this great model.
Zoe?
So one example that I'd like to bring up is the Lower Mystic vulnerability assessment. There's an infrastructure vulnerability assessment through the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, which some of you may be aware of, but this is an organization that functions on a regional scale, and then so Boston is a part of this organization. And then for various projects, we sort of scaled out to specific areas in the region. So this particular project, the Lower Mystic Infrastructure Vulnerability Assessment, also included a social vulnerability assessment component. From the beginning of this process, though, it was really critical for the folks who were running this process and within the Resilient Mystic Collaborative generally, to ensure that community voices are present at the table alongside the various other sectors that are represented within this entity. So it's there is a municipal representation, but also community leaders, nonprofit leaders, and various other sectors. So they were a part of the development of this planning process. But for the social vulnerability piece specifically, I was really impressed with the process that they were moving through, which was to identify community leaders to essentially develop engagement plans for their specific community and take ownership over the community engagement process for this project. And the way that they were integrating accessibility, also mindful of the fact that the pandemic was in full swing. So people were tired and overextended. And this was an opportunity to sort of integrate some empathy building as we're talking about infrastructure vulnerabilities and dependencies and how that impacts vulnerable communities. Those were the conversations that we were having, but they were facilitated by community folk within their community talking about the community's these things. So yeah, Resilient Mystic Collaborative does really great work in that regard.
Great. So I think I just have one more question for you all before we wrap up, and I think that there's going to be a facilitated interactive exercise that Moira is going to take on. But since the call to action for us today has been to focus on civic research agendas, and we've hit on a couple, recurring themes here around storytelling, around empathy, around language access and access in general. Is there anything else that you would like this room, which includes academics, community members, potentially funders, and has this vested interest in addressing climate resilience, but potentially has not heard everything that you had to say about this? And I don't think that we're going to get to everything you have to say today, but is there something, knowing that everybody's about to participate in this interactive exercise towards a civic research agenda, that you think folks in this room should keep in mind? I'll let any one of you start.
I can start. I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about recently is that, at least it has been my experience working with the city, is that we function in these moments, especially around community engagement. We have these projects, which are specific moments in time. We have these community engagement events, which are specific moments in time. And I think there's this question of continuity in these processes, and thinking about how that, I just sort of think that life is continually going, and people don't necessarily when you're bringing them into these processes, they're not thinking in the same moments that you're thinking in. And there's a real conversational element when we're talking about engaging with communities in our work that I think sometimes is missing. Like we send out a survey to make sure that people go to these events. We engage them in the event. We share out what happened after the event and then step back. And so I'd just like to put forward that thinking about new models of how we learn in consistent conversation. I know that that's tricky to do, especially for the city. We have to digest and things like that. But I would be interested in exploring what remaining conversation more consistently looks like.
I'll go next. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the concept of academic supremacy recently as almost an analog to white supremacy. It's something, it's the water that academics swim in and often aren't aware of. And academics carry a lot of power into contexts that they go into, especially in community-based work. And if we have no awareness of our positionality with communities and people we're trying to partner with, there's a high likelihood that we're going to be damaged. A mentor of mine is a former CEO of World Vision, and World Vision does a lot of interesting stuff that is open for praise and critique. But when he became CEO, he did a lot of work to do monitoring and evaluation of programs across sub-Saharan Africa, and found that they actually weren't doing a lot of good, and had these rich anecdotes of why they weren't doing good. One was they had an initiative to try to reduce indoor exposure to cooking pollutants. And so they found, well, one of the best ways that we can do that is to put a hole in the thatch roof and ventilate. And so they went into a community, they did that throughout the whole community. They said, this is gonna help you commute better. And they came back a few months later and all those holes were closed up and the vents were gone. I said, what happened? They said, well, spirits can get in through the roof, through that hole. And so we had to close it up so spirits can get in. So there's no sense of the context that they were working in because they didn't take the time to listen, right? On the other end of the spectrum, they would do a project, come back to a community, and he had this great story of coming back into a community and looking up on a hill and seeing this like elaborate constructed thing on top of the hill. And he asked what that was, and they said, oh, that's a shrine to a new god. I say, who is this new god? Well, it's the god called World Vision. Right, so it's this opposite ends of the spectrum of like, you didn't listen, and so it's totally ineffective, or you just enhanced your supremacy as an organization. Both are disempowering, right? And so I think an anecdote to that academic supremacy is understanding our positionality and listening a lot. So the first thing that he did when he sort of assimilated all these stories is say, okay, if we're going into a new community, you cannot spend $1 or do anything for 18 months. You have to listen, you have to develop relationships, you have to really understand and develop an agenda with a community. And so I think that's a lesson that we can learn as academics.
I love that model.
Yeah, I think as Scott was saying, moving at the speed of trust is something that I think is super important, and relationship building and taking the time to really connect with residents, connect with whatever community you are working with. I think moves mountains. I think researchers come in, they leave, and research is really fast moving, and so taking the actual time to like learn about the community members, where they're coming from, hear their stories, I think is how we make change, and it's how research can be more impactful.
Great. So I know the topic of this panel was centering communities amidst the push for radical change. I think we talked a lot about slowing down and listening. I understand that we're in the midst of a climate crisis, and that's not what anybody wants to hear. So I hope that as you participate in this exercise, we can strike a healthy balance between slowing down in order to speed up.
Yep, exactly.
And then pass it over to Mo.
Oh, thank you. Well, first a round of applause for the panel. Thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. On that note, I always say, what do I say, Sage and Natalie? Slow down so that we can get where we need to be faster, right? So it's exactly that way. And the other side of it is there's nothing like the computer crashing on you to give you a huge dose of humility and figure things out overnight. So, but thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. What the plan that we have for today is for anybody who is game to try something new in terms of, just coordinating conversations. We heard this morning and also as part of the panel, how, there are all of these conversations, these bodies of knowledge, these different languages. We're all talking about the same thing, but in different ways. What we're going to try to do is an exercise in participatory modeling and just have a demonstration. It's a demonstration of how we can use different kinds of tools, both low tech, markers, post-its, wizard wall kind of stuff, and higher tech, not really high tech, but like higher tech on the computer, virtual whiteboards, and so on, to have a sense of how can we coordinate conversations around issues of climate change and incorporating different bodies of knowledge together to make sense of the fuller picture, the richer picture, where the barriers are to advancing on that issue, especially around, say, heat, urban heat, which is a major concern here in Boston. And what are things that we could do? What are some possible next steps and maybe surprising interventions that we hadn't thought of? So for those of you who want to stay, we invite you to stay. We would love it if everybody stays. We'll have something also for the people online. So I'll be moderating that, but then Natalie, can you raise your hand? Sage and Dean here are going to be your facilitators in person while I facilitate online. So I'll let people just move around and get situated, to take like a very brief 2-minute break so that we can just set up the room for that. But again, thank you very much for the panel. That was a wonderful discussion. Thank you. So we're going to try to get people organized around 3 tables. Space, like if it could be like more or less an equal amount of people per table, that would be great. So just to give you a little bit of introduction, because I hear Natalie making an introduction. So Sage and Natalie just finished my first iteration of my participatory modeling class, and congratulations to them for surviving that. Dean has worked with me for like 13 years, and congratulations for surviving that. Okay, well, we've been working in this space for a very long time, just evolving and developing some tools and approaches to do this kind of work around complex problems, complex social and environmental problems. So the task here that we're thinking of as a demonstration, again, of this kind of activity and the potential for it, is to try to draw a diagram of what causes heat, urban heat, besides climate change, because clearly climate change is a huge factor, and we want to reduce it, right? But there are other urban factors that contribute to it, that exacerbate it. And at the same time, there are other things that might actually reduce it, right? So, but how do they interact with each other? Do they cancel each other out? Do they reinforce each other? So those are some kinds of questions that we need to understand, because when we're thinking of what interventions do we want to make in the city, well, we need to know if those interventions have a chance of succeeding or having an impact, right? And so that's kind of like the first guiding questions. And Natalie, Sage, and Dean are going to help you, remind you of that question as we go along. So what are the factors that contribute to extreme heat beyond climate change? What are the ramifications? So what are some of the ripple effects? If we think of, I don't know, health, costs, et cetera, inequity, what do we need to know to act on this problem, and what barriers might exist to that action? So those are kind of like our guiding questions to develop this causal diagram. And so what Sage and Dean and Natalie are going to show you is how do you create these diagrams? And essentially you can have post-its there where you write the names of factors, sometimes called variables or issues or topics that influence the problem. And then with the markers of different colors, you're going to draw connections, right? Some connections between these factors that make the problem complex. Because If it were easy to solve, hey, we would have addressed this a long time ago, right? So there's definitely a complexity to it that makes it hard. So we're going to spend about 15 or so minutes doing that while I do it online. So wait for me, people on Zoom. I'll be right there. And we'll do it together in different kinds of tools. So you've got like a tangible, drawing board kind of thing. I have it virtual, and I'll show you then the difference. And then what other tools are there, like very quickly, that also lend or shed a different kind of light on this same problem. But they're all participatory, so they're all for participatory modeling. Okay, does this sound good? Any questions, fears, concerns, excitement? Okay, good, great. My adrenaline is on high because again, like the computer did crash right before this started. So, okay, so let's get started. I'll put the microphone down and I'll let every table do their own thing.
There we go. But what we're going to do is we're going to use a different tool that is like a whiteboard that is online. And then what I'm doing here is I'm going to share that. So here we go. And so again, like the idea is to try to address this question of, what are the factors that contribute to extreme heat beyond climate change in Boston or just in any urban area. And I can, for example, add this component that's called urban heat as the core of what we're trying to address, right? So I know that climate change, for example, is a huge factor affecting urban heat. So what I do here is I create a connection, and the causal link here is what we call a positive one, because they change in the same direction. So as climate change gets worse, urban heat gets worse, right? So just as a way to start the conversation, an initial idea. So what are some other factors that contribute to urban heat? And we can add them one by one.
Population density?
Population density. Okay, so let's put this here. As population density goes up, just because you have more people, urban heat goes up, right? Excellent.
Loss of tree canopy?
Tree canopy. So let's put it as, because it's easier to see, like if it increases, right? Then urban heat is going to decrease. This is a negative. We call it as a negative. It's not a negative effect. It's an inverse relationship. So as this one goes up, then urban heat will go down. But if this one goes down, this one will go up, right? So that's the meaning of this negative, and you see it as a different sign and a different color. Now, do these two affect each other, for example? They may or may not.
Not sure.
How about too much concrete and
impervious? Yes, that's one of my favorite ones. Impervious surface, right? So we've got impervious surface, and so clearly it directly increases heat, right? And again, like the question here is there any relationship between these other ones, directly or indirectly? Maybe we need more factors in here. What do you all think?
I would assume the more impervious surfaces we have, the fewer trees we have, but we might have to do some research there.
Right, so you can leave it as a question mark, but I would say that you are right. So this would be a negative, right? Because the more of one there is, the less of the other there is, right? And maybe if we make room for trees, maybe we also get rid of impervious surface, right? If you think this as a possible intervention point that we do want to increase, to do that, we might need to get rid of some impervious surface, right?
What about building materials?
So what about those? What kinds of building materials?
Well, I don't know a lot about this, but I'm just like thinking slate roofs, for example.
Split roofs?
No, slate.
Oh, slate roofs, sorry.
And there must be other materials that either exacerbate heat or provide a cooling effect.
Right, so would we talk about, let's talk about like heat trapping materials? Yes?
Yeah.
So what we have here, I wonder if we could think of maybe just like, so if there are more.
Is that related to impervious surface?
I was wondering about that.
Mm.
I was wondering about that. So then maybe it's not through here that the relationship is, but through here, right? And then there's also like just the development itself, right? I'm thinking. So we've got development. Development might increase heat trapping materials, right? And then maybe it's the population density that drives development in some way. What do you think of that?
I'm thinking about like green infrastructure and like splash pads or like cooling techniques. I don't know what the word is.
Yes. So we have conversely green infrastructure. You know, if we think of it could be related to development. Okay. It could be, and here's a question. With development, do we have green infrastructure, more of it or not? You know, that could be a policy thing. But definitely green infrastructure will reduce. Let me just move this so that it becomes a little bit clearer. There we go. Okay, this is shaping up nicely.
I know, I'm loving this mental modeler. Is this a free application?
It is definitely free.
I need to use this, okay.
I know. It's really cool, and then I'll show you more stuff about it that I think you'll love. Okay, so is there anything else that we need to add here?
Yes, transportation.
Yes, I was wondering about that. So definitely, and how do we add it as, should we separate, like say car use? Should we separate transit use? And it is related to definitely population density and development, no?
Yes, and then the active transportation options are kind of the opposite. Not sure how to model that, but.
So let's try like this, and let's try like this, right? And so we have on one hand, population density might actually incentivize transit use, right? As density goes up, so does transit use. But development might increase, you know, car use. And then my suggestion, okay, you might have a totally different view of this and how it works. Now, do you think that these have a relationship between each other?
Oh, I would think that more public transportation, less need for cars.
Exactly. So that would make it then a negative, right? On this way. And probably the more people use cars, the less they use transit, right?
Right.
So,
and even going back to population density, if you build more transit stops, you might have more density near those stops. I'm seeing it right now in Alston. They keep building up buildings where they opened up a commuter rail where they didn't used to be one.
So what we could do here, so stops, transit stops. So transit use might motivate the building of, no, you're saying the population density.
Exactly. Yeah.
And building. Yes, yeah. Like this.
Yeah. And I also see a relation where development will increase population density also, not just vice versa. If you build it, they will come. And that's exactly what's happening in Alston.
Okay, so then maybe this relationship here might actually be really just through here, right? So it's kind of like an indirect relationship from population to transit stops to transit use. Awesome. Yeah. And so then the thing is that car use will increase urban heat.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
And it starts to become difficult to not cross lines. So, you know, like you always keep like moving things around. That's why we have like kind of whiteboard and stickies with people so that they can also move things around. Otherwise, it's just hard as you add things. And okay, so is, you know, anything else like impacts maybe of urban heat?
Oh, may I add one more?
Yes, yes.
Before we shift gears, fuel choice, fossil fuel choices.
So how about then, oh, wait, do you want to do it like that, or do you want to do it through price, like gas price?
Oh, I meant fossil fuel versus electric or wind, solar.
Okay.
Separate from the whole cost issue, that more the environmental impacts, but.
Wait, so then, right, so okay. So in addition to that, then in terms of what you're saying is that they exacerbate climate change.
Correct.
Right? There we go. Okay, so this definitely exacerbates climate change. Okay. And then it feeds back, right? So what we're seeing then is like, I think that there's something missing in terms of impacts again. So what's the impact of urban heat on the population and like what they do about it?
It makes people sick.
Yeah.
Right. So public health is a huge one, right? And so urban heat will decrease public health, right? And what else will public health do? If we're thinking again, and I'm prompting this because I just have my, you know, hat as a planner and / pseudo fraudulent economist, is cost, right? So there's a, you know, public cost that as the population is healthier, the public cost decreases, right? But if public health is low, then the public cost also increases, right? But there's another aspect of like what happens when people get hot.
I was just about to say the vicious cycle of adding cooling facilities, like the example of the triple decker with the slate roof, which is exactly what I have.
Yes.
If I were to put in central air conditioning, it's a vicious cycle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as urban heat gets worse, air conditioning goes up. But as air conditioning goes up, heat gets worse.
Right.
And it's what you're saying is exactly the kind of thing that this causal diagramming can help identify, which is these vicious cycles here, here, here. You know, like there are a whole bunch of different reinforcing loops. And then air conditioning also adds to the public cost.
Right.
Right?
Right.
How does that look to you?
Very difficult to untangle.
Well, but you just did. You actually did untangle it. And the cool thing about it is that you were able to identify, again, what are some of the reinforcing mechanisms that keep things stuck and that make it so hard to then, you know, do something about this. So where should the intervention be to try to break some of these things? And for example, could we establish a relationship here between growing development and green infrastructure? Because that will change the way things go, perhaps. I don't know.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So let me just check in with the rest of the room because we were really fast. We were good. And so just let me see how everybody else is doing because I'm also looking at the time.
Thanks, that was interesting.
Thank you. No, thank you.
Thank you.
I have more questions about this. Right, hold on. No, so let me ask you.
Too.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I know challenges was on the agenda too.
Right, so thinking about what are some of the data that exists to inform the problem and what data may need to be collected, for example, right? Or you know, like given this and what we know about these linkages, is there something that we don't know about that needs to be collected, for example? Can this help us identify what is it that we don't know and we need to find out more?
Are we collecting how much green space is being lost per each high rise that goes up?
Exactly. So that's a really good example of the kinds of things that we can see that they might have an influence, but we don't know. We don't have the information for it, so we might need to collect data on that. The other thing to think about is like, what are possible intervention points in the system? So one we talked about here, this link between development and green infrastructure, right? But are there others?
The increase or decrease of transit stops, looking to see which would be better.
Right, exactly. Because who knows like how the direction in which these go. So if you thought that you liked Mental Modeler, now you'll see something else that I'm going to show you. But let me just first check in with the rest of the room to see where we are. Okay, hold on a second. Hello, people. How are we doing? Good. Are people having fun? First of all, yes. Okay, good. And are you finding some interesting insights and connections that maybe you hadn't thought of before? Okay, awesome. So I want to wrap up this part in a couple of minutes, just to stay with the schedule. Do you, facilitators, do you feel that it's at a good point to kind of like, 2 minutes? 2 minutes? Okay, great. So we'll do 2 minutes. So I'll give you a preview, exclusive for you guys. Then I'll share it with the others. But one of the things that Mental Modeler has that is really cool, it is a little bit of a black box. And then you have to also take it with a grain of salt, because you have to understand that this is based on our collective perception. But if we were to do this again, if we were to do this with other people, there might be just a different, just a different view of what the connections are. But there's a feature here that's called scenario. And what you can do is run pseudo simulations. They're not really simulations, but you can change things. Like, for example, we're talking about transit stops, right? What if we increased the transit stops? What would it do? And so here you can see the ripple effects of, like, of course, you would have much more transit use, and you would have a little bit of an impact in terms of reducing car use and in reducing, the factors contributing to climate change. And what you can do is then do this for different ones. So for example, right now in green infrastructure, if I were to, increase it, I would have, sorry, I've got to move your faces here to the left. So you would have a reduction in a pretty significant reduction in urban heat. And because of that, you would have an increase in public health and a reduction in air conditioning, right? It's interesting that it doesn't show as much repercussion in terms of public cost. And it may be simply because, well, you are not reducing air conditioning that much. But I mean, just to give you a sense of the ripple effects. Now, if we were to, for example, change the model to make this relationship a positive one, how would that scenario change, I wonder? So I don't know, maybe it doesn't make a difference. And so let's go back to 0, and then let's go back to 1. And what it doesn't seem to make that much more of a difference in that relationship, okay? And then you can combine things. So what if, I don't know what other things, maybe we just reduce the number of heat trapping materials, okay? And if we do that, well, we have definitely some change in terms of urban heat. We have increases in urban health because of that, and we have reductions in public costs and in air conditioning. So these are the kinds of things that you can explore with this kind of tool, just to give you a sense. And then you can do combinations as well.
So that's only, the simulation's only based on the way we mapped it and the weight that we gave each thing.
Exactly.
So it's not like it has some special data access.
No, you shouldn't look at the numbers. I don't know why they even have numbers. The numbers really don't mean anything. But so here, what's happening is that you can actually change, if like we could have like continued conversations around this, because maybe this link between car use and urban heat is much stronger than the link between air conditioning and urban heat, or the other way around. I don't know, actually. So we might have different information and ideas about the relative strength of each one of these connections. So here you can represent that in different ways. And so that will give you then different results, and it does allow you to have a sense of like what would make more of an impact as a policy or as a set of policies. But quite frankly, I do think, though, that the strength of this approach is really in seeing where these reinforcing loops are that either can become vicious cycles, but can also be converted into virtuous cycles if you leverage them and nudge them in the right way, in the right direction, or in the direction that we all want. And then you can see like these ripple effects, like, you know, in the end, like we might want to improve something and we end up making things worse because we are not necessarily aware of these, you know, self-reinforcing loops.
Yeah. Are you, when you doing scenarios in mental modeler, could you like pair environmental factors with housing affordability factors, for example?
Absolutely. If you feel that there's a connection that could be direct or indirect, then absolutely, yes, you can certainly represent that. Absolutely. And I think that, you know, this part of the system definitely can go in that direction where you can see that, right? The density.
Yeah, because when you add transit stops, gentrification goes crazy. People get
right.
Exactly.
So you could add, you know, gentrification here. Okay, so that actually increases gentrification. That will increase housing prices.
Right, that's another vicious cycle. You try to create equity by adding stops in neighborhoods, and then you get gentrification. Yeah.
Right, and then housing prices go up, and then you can continue thinking of, okay, what's the ripple effect of that? As that goes up, affordability goes down. As affordability goes down, people have to be displaced, right? So displacement increases and so on. Absolutely. So you can, you know, continue iterating over these conversations, and then you can see the relationship between, you know, aspects of climate change and urban heat, and then what it does, you know, to affordability, or like vice versa, the other way around. And the interesting thing also is like who suffers then, and once you start to tease out, you know, who gets displaced and who is affected by urban heat, that becomes more of a spatial problem. And that's where we're going to go next in the conversation. I'll show you in a little bit. Okay?
This is great. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. So I think it's time to wrap up a little bit, if that's okay. Just to share, because again, this is a demo. It's not a full exercise because that would require more time, right? But just to give you a flavor of the kind of exercise that this is.
Okay, so how was it? Any interesting insights? Things that you haven't thought of before? You know everything? Yes.
It's neat to brainstorm together and see things that, you know, aren't top of mind. What I'm curious about is, you know, maybe all of our tables were, you know, the same or different. Like, what do we do with this? You know, like maybe in Boston, all of our tables would look basically the same. You know, like we've come with similar ideas, but how do we develop a research agenda from this, or an action plan, rather than just like better describing the problem?
That's great. And I did not plan that question. Okay.
I know, I didn't either, I swear.
Okay. But that's perfect. So if I can share here to your question of whether our diagrams are all the same. This is the diagram that we created in my group. Okay. And I'm sure that there are some things that are similar, but I'm sure that there are also differences. Am I right? Or okay, so the, oh, sorry, I forgot to share. Yes, thank you.
Can you make the text a little bigger? Is it?
Can you see? Yeah, there we go. Great. So did you have any similar relationships in your group? In similar connections? Yeah, and what are some things that may be different?
Well, we had impervious surfaces and tree canopy. It's pretty similar actually. We also captured their mutual reinforcement in relation to heat.
Right. So yes, go ahead, please.
We actually had the relationship between urban heat and air conditioning going in the other direction.
Oh, how did you do that?
Air conditioning is pulling heat out of buildings and spitting it into the environment.
Right, right. So that's why we have air conditioning increases urban heat, right? Because it's spitting all the.
Wouldn't the arrow be on the other end?
Oh, it's going both ways.
It's going both ways. It's just that, you know, it's kind of weird because it's covered by the other one, but it's going this way and then in that way, right? So it's this self-reinforcing thing, right? It makes things worse, right? What else in terms of, you know, self-reinforcing cycles that you saw, whether virtuous or what vicious, that might be sticky points or opportunities? Yes.
One variable we started talking about at the end was like heat transfer. So if you're reducing urban heat, then where is the electricity being produced, or where is the heat getting transferred to instead? So that was something we were talking about.
Oh, that's very interesting. We haven't thought of that part. Yes.
One thing that we didn't think about when we were going over this before was so if there was more biking and walking and transportation, then there was less car use, but there's also and then there's also like less heat. But then if there's more heat itself, though, then that also would lead to less biking too, because maybe it's just too hot to walk.
Ah, interesting ripple effect. Yes.
We captured that as well, but taking one more step and just thinking about heat as cause of mortality, and that a heat event when you have pedestrian travel is actually, those pedestrians are more vulnerable to heat and therefore mortality.
Right. Wow. So I feel we didn't get there. We did other things. We did too.
Yeah, our group didn't get this. We didn't talk about things like gentrification or housing prices or development itself. Really, we talked about like buildings more generally.
Right, but this is very, very interesting because here, when you have like population density, increased transit stops, that probably increases the presence of pedestrians, right, and bikers as well. But then that can be like a counter effect or a detrimental effect when you have like more and more heat as well, right, being pushed in different into the environment. And so, as you see, like there are some similarities that help then what would happen next in a process like this is that we would try to synthesize what are the things that are common and make a synthetic diagram, but then also highlight the new things that each group would bring to the thinking process of like all of these connections that maybe we think about it in pieces because we are working on different aspects of the problem, right? But it's important to connect them because then this goes to the next step of the question of like, what do we do with this? So what, right? Well, first of all, we engaged already in a thinking process, in a thought process that is, that we don't often engage in, but it helps us coordinate our conversation and our views. That's one, outcome of this. The other is by doing so, we're finding common language, common vocabulary, common ways of reasoning through the problem. And that's another outcome of this. It's also creating this fuller picture. And we can start to identify things like these self-reinforcing parts of the system that keeps us stuck and doesn't let us like look for ways out, or it's not easy to look for ways out, that are self-reinforcing loops. Okay, like for example, this one here, or there's this one here that we were just mentioning, and there could be others. But the other aspect that I want to share with you is, this is not, can I switch to a different window and come? It's not letting me.
Yeah, you're full screen.
Oh, that's why. Okay, yeah, there we go. Thank you. So I cheated, and I have my own diamond as well. But what we did with my group, so this is my own, right? This is my, well, actually, no. This is with Dean and with Sage. We kind of like came up with this one. And again, you'll see that there are similar things here. but others that may be a little bit different, okay? But one of the things that you can do, this is another method that is called mental modeler. And here you can run pseudo simulations. They're not actual simulations. They just respond to what we think, how we think this system is structured. But what we can do is, knowing how the system is structured, we can think of like, okay, so what if something change? And so here what I distinguished is in these green variables or factors, I tried to distinguish some intervention points in the system. And so if I were to change things like, for example, increase carbon taxes, what would that do? And so this is, again, not an actual simulation. It's a representation of our collective mental model of how the system is interconnected. And if I change it, if I kind of like nudge the system in a particular way, it's telling me here that, well, gas prices are clearly going to go up. But because of that, transit use is going to go up a little bit, and car use is going to be reduced. Okay, but it doesn't tell me much about urban heat. So I'm like, that didn't really give me the kind of impact that I was hoping for. But what if then I changed maybe this relationship, which I had as a question mark, right? I had this relationship, this could be an intervention point where development may lead to the creation of more green roofs, or it could be the opposite, but I can set it up as a, say, like as a policy, okay? So now the more development there is, the more green roofs there are. And so let me see now if I, I see, it didn't change that. Okay, it's not going to show a change because it's not set as an intervention. But let me show you a different kind of intervention then. So one of them was, say, parking requirements. And so if I were to decrease parking requirements, what would that do? And so of course, much less parking, because of that, much less car use. There's going to be an increase in transit use, and there's going to be some reduction in urban heat. But if I were like, as you see, like there's not much of an impact in urban heat, which is like really frustrating. It's like, why isn't that working? Well, what if I were to actually follow the policy of that is proposed for the city in terms of really adding more vegetated cover to the city? And so here you do see a lot more of impact in terms of different ways. So one is because we're going to increase vegetated cover, we're going to increase impervious cover. And that is a self-reinforcing effect that will reduce urban heat significantly, reduce air conditioning, and again, reinforcing effect. So it's going to reduce urban heat, and that increases public health. So what this kind of approach allows you to think about is create this mental structure, synthesize it, and then run some of these very simple, simulations that again are not actual simulations, they're pseudo simulations, but it tells you like, given how we think the system is wired, what are the kinds of impacts different policies would have? And then the other thing, final thing that I wanted to show you is if we were to, like we were talking in our group about spatial changes, because through gentrification, for example, if we increase transit use through increasing the frequency of transit stops supported by population density. But what ends up happening is that it increases housing prices. It ends up displacing people through gentrification. And then these people end up in neighborhoods that are suffering more the effects of urban heat, right? So again, like another reinforcing process there. The problem is we can't really represent that in space in this kind of diagram, but there are some spatial representations. And that's part of the work that we've done with Dean and my team here at Northeastern in terms of creating a platform that allows people to then visualize a neighborhood here, like you've got streets and buildings and some, pervious cover and impervious cover and so on. And here it's like we try to simulate an aspect of mass and cast intersection there, but where here you don't have any green infrastructure, here you do have green infrastructure. And if we were to simulate this, you can actually, it will do it for me. There we go. That's without green infrastructure, and this is with green infrastructure, and you can see that it does, how the green infrastructure can have a difference when it's there in terms of ameliorating heat, but also to think about how this can be different and feel different and have a different implication for different people with different values. So another thing that you can represent that is something that we worked on in our platform is the fact that, you know, if I'm a public official, I'm really keen on keeping our costs low. If I'm a resident, I really want to just be safe and not have a public, you know, a health problem because of excessive heat. And I just don't have maybe money for air conditioning and such, so I really just want to focus on reducing urban heat. And if I'm a doctor, I'm thinking of something else. And so there are all of these, we all want the same thing, but the way to get there might be different, and it has different implications in the things that different people care about. So this is a way to combine and coordinate that conversation where you don't just see the biophysical and spatial representation of heat and where it is and what causes it, but you're also seeing, like, if we were to install green infrastructure in different places of different kinds, what are the trade-offs? What are the things that are beneficial to whom? What are the costs for whom? And what do we do about that? So this is essentially a representation of that prioritization for each person. And this is a way to compare across people how, you know, around a solution, what people might think and how they might value that solution. So I just wanted to share that as a way to kind of like wrap up, but like just share with everybody the kinds of exercises that you can be, and the kinds of approaches and tools that you can use to coordinate this kind of conversation, you know, around what do we do about urban heat and climate change collectively as a community. So again, this is something that we've launched. It's called Flora AI, and the prototype whiteboard will be available for the public to play with this summer. So we're aiming for June, July. That's when it's gonna be out. But, you know, check us out, check out the website, flora.ai, and, you know, send us your information so we can keep you updated on the new developments of this particular tool. And the other one that I showed you is Mental Modeler. This one here is called Mental Modeler, which also you might want to take a look at. It's also for free, where like the focus is to make everything available. And if you don't have anything else, Wizard Wall, Post-it notes and markers work wonders as well. Okay. Any, you know, questions or final thoughts before I let you all go to, you know, get some lunch? Yes.
So how do we go from something like this to a data agenda and decide from this structure what pieces of data we should be collecting now to inform decisions later?
So some people in my group had wonderful ideas about that. Are they still online? Because maybe they can actually address this question. But one of the things that they were suggesting to look into that we don't know, based on this particular diagram, is this relationship between impervious surface and tree canopy. And I'm just trying to figure out, like, when we build impervious surface, how much are we taking out of tree canopy, or vice versa, right? That's something that maybe we need to start like just monitoring to see if are we really making a difference. Because if we're not doing this strongly, or we're doing it lopsidedly, right, then we're not really encouraging a transformation or as strong of a transformation, right? So that's the kind of data, or that's the kind of conversation that can happen around what data is missing, what new data do we need in order to address some of the questions we may have about this system. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, in part. You know, I think there are lots of parts to this. You know, there's also what data exists
Yes.
we don't have access to.
Exactly.
And just,
yes,
you know, how can they be used as proxies for other things?
Exactly. No, that's all, you know, excellent points. And so this kind of diagramming collective, and the emphasis here is in the collective diagram, you can do is engage in that conversation to start to identify, well, you know what, might be important, but we don't know enough about it. But we do have this information. Can this be a proxy? Right? Yes, Slate.
I just also wanted to, I don't know if it was articulated, but you know, we're in an academic conference, but when you do this in the field, the people around the table are hopefully the very kind of stakeholders who are actually in the system, making decisions about the system, and might have access to these kinds of different expertises and interventions that you might want to do. So when we're thinking about, like, yes, this is a conceptual model, we can think about the way it helps research, but it's also very active. And so it bridges right away to, you know, now we have a shared understanding, which makes it a lot easier to work together. And now we actually all are the right people to do that. And so where can we go from there? As opposed to just doing this as an academic exercise.
That's the level way above.
No, the community is
the community, and it works amazingly. Yeah. There's so much wisdom, collective wisdom, and this is a great support to actually, you know, coordinate it and create innovation out of it. We've had extensive experience doing this with communities, and it's just wonderful every single time. Yes, I think that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a quick comment that I've seen examples of very similar community modeling process in Flint, Michigan, to identify the root of the crisis around lead poisoning. And I think that it was an incredible example of the process at galvanizing community organizations to come together and get to the root causes of some sort of very systemic problems. And kind of define their political priorities.
Absolutely. So the creator of Mental Modeler, Stephen Gray, is at MSU. And he used this tool with communities in Flint to try to, you know, in a way, just process the crisis and the trauma from that. And they are also using it in Flint for their food system as well. So we had, you know, some of the team in our classes guest speakers. And then in the back, yes.
Yeah, we use this modeling for a youth violence systems project that gave us, and the youth were actually involved in helping to understand the variables, and even gang members, former gang.
Yes.
And it created common language, like you said.
Absolutely.
And it also, you were able to input some of the data, you know, from the field.
Yes, and you know, remember, community members are experts. They really are experts. They have a wealth of knowledge that we really need to be able to capture and engage with in productive ways. So this is one way to do that. Were there any other plans? Yes, Steve.
I could just say something too, with the work we've done, where in the community, a different issue with flooding, like if there was one community where there was a lot of flooding happening, there was maybe some degree of denial in the community that flooding actually is a problem. But if you did this kind of exercise, we got to understand actually, well, flooding really is there. It's more than just an issue of like having to just water walk through. It's holding back the whole community. And so with that though, then you can say, okay, well, what else is holding back? Well, how can we fix flooding? Like we could just build something, but we'll have to maintain it. And so what do we need to do to actually have the resources then, like to create a virtuous cycle to create all these interventions? So like you could make a infrastructure, you make GreenRoots, but like how does that ripple through the whole system, and what do we need to do to support those, to get the resources to be able to support those kinds of interventions? And that's what this kind of project can do.
Yes, and it was very transformative. So again, to wrap up, you know, it was the idea for this session was to just give you a demonstration of different tools and approaches that can leverage this collective wisdom and innovation and capacity to innovate and support coordinated and productive conversations around complex problems. So I hope you had fun. I hope you enjoyed it. And, you know, I look forward to future conversations with you all.